Good day everyone, this is Manilyn Suazo, a secondary student of Bachelor of Science in Criminology Section A. So my topic is all about Chapter 2, Abnormal Behavior. What is abnormal behavior? Abnormal behavior is something deviating from the normal or differing from the typical, is subjectively defined behavioral characteristics assigned to those with rare or dysfunctional conditions. It may be abnormal when it's unusual, socially unacceptable, it's it self-defecting, dangerous, or suggestive of faculty interpretation of reality or of personal distress. Example of abnormal behavior is depression. It is commonly seen as a deviation from ideal mental stability. It often stops the individual from functioning a normal life, and though it is a relatively common mental disorder, it is still statistically infrequent. An American Psychiatric Association defines abnormal behavior in medical terms as a mental illness that affects or is manifested in a person's brain, can affect the way a person thinks, behaves, and interacts with people. What is psychopathology? So psychopathology is the scientific study of mental disorders, including efforts to understand their genetic, biological, psychological, and social causes. Affective classification teams or nosology course across all stages of development, manifestations, and treatment. It is also defined as the origin of mental disorders, how they developed, and the symptoms they might produce in a person. The four Ds of psychopathology: the deviance, distress, dysfunction, and danger. Deviance describes the idea that specific thoughts, behaviors, and emotions are considered deviant when they are unacceptable or not common in society. We define an individual's actions as deviant or abnormal when his or her behavior is deemed unacceptable by the culture he or she belongs to. Distress. These terms accounts for negative feeling by the individual with the disorder. He or she may feel deeply troubled and affected by their illness. Dysfunction involves maladaptive behavior that impairs the individual's ability to perform normal daily functions such as getting ready for work in the morning or driving a car. Such maladaptive behaviors prevent the individual from living a normal and healthy lifestyle. Dysfunction behavior is not always caused by a disorder. It may be voluntary, such as engaging in hunger strike. Danger involves dangerous or violent behavior directed at the individual or others in the environment. An example of dangerous behavior that may suggest a psychological disorder is engaging in suicidal activity. So next is models of abnormality. Behavior. Believe that our actions are determined largely by the experiences we have in life rather than by underlying pathology or unconscious forces. Behaviorism states that all behavior, including abnormal, is learned from the environment or nurture, and that all behavior that has been learned can also be unlearned, which is how abnormal is treated. Cognitive. The cognitive approach that a person's thoughts are responsible for their behavior. The basic assumptions are maladaptive behavior. It is caused by faulty and irrational conditions. It is the way you think about a problem rather than the problem itself that causes mental disorders. Individuals can overcome mental disorders by learning to use more appropriate cognitions. The individual is an active processor of information. How a person perceives, anticipates, and elevates events rather than the events themselves, which will have an impact on behavior. This is generally believed to be an automatic process. In other words, we do not really think about it. Biological. Medical model of psychology believes that disorders have an organic or physical cause. They focus on this approach is on genetics, neurotransmitters, physiology, neuroanatomy, biochemistry, etc. Example of biochemistry. The dopamine hypothesis argues that elevated levels of dopamine are related to symptoms of schizophrenia. The approach argues that mental disorders are related to the differences in brain structure and functioning of the brain. Psychodynamic. Main, main assumptions includes Freud's belief that abnormality came from the psychological causes rather than the physical causes. Unresolved conflicts between the ID, ego, and superego can all contribute to abnormality. For example, weak ego. Well-adjusted people have a strong ego that is able to cope with the demands of both the ID and the superego by allowing each express itself at appropriate times. Unchecked impulses. If ID impulses are unchecked, they may be expressed in self-destructive and immoral behavior, or the dangerously abnormal behavior in adulthood. Too powerful superego. A superego that is too powerful and therefore too harsh and inflexible in its moral values will restrict the ID to such an extent that the person will be deprived of even socially acceptable pleasures. According to Freud, this would create neuroses, which could be expressed in the symptoms of anxiety disorders such as phobias and obsessions. Next is identification of abnormal behavior. Deviation from statistical norm. The word abnormal means away from the norm. Many population facts are measured such as height, weight, and intelligence. Intelligence. It is statistically abnormal for a person to get a score below 55, but only the lowest score is considered abnormal. Anxiety. A person who is anxious all the time or has a high level of anxiety, and someone who almost never feels anxiety are all considered to be abnormal. Deviation from social norm. Every culture has certain standards for acceptable behavior. Behavior that deviates from the standard is considered to be abnormal behavior. Maladaptive behavior. The third criterion is how the behavior affects the well-being of the individual and or social group. Maladapt- Maladaptive to oneself. It refers to the inability of a person to reach goals or to adapt the demands of life. Maladaptive to society. It refers to the person's obstruction or disruption to social group functioning. Personal distress considers abnormality in terms of the individual's subjective feeling personal distress rather than his behavior. Failure to function adequately. A person is considered abnormal if they are unable to cope with the demands. To cope with the demands of life. The following are characteristics that define failure to function adequately. First is suffering. Second, maladaptiveness or danger to self. Next is vividness and unconditionality stands out. Unpredictably and loss of control. Irrationality or incomprehensibility causes observer discomfort and violates moral or social standards. Deviation from ideal mental health. We define what normal or ideal is, and anything that deviates from this is regarded as abnormal. There are six criteria by which mental health could be measured. First, positive view to self, capability for growth and development, anatomy and independence, accurate perception of reality, positive friendships and relationships, and environmental mastery, or able to meet the varying demands of day-to-day situation. Lastly, symptoms of abnormal behavior. Long periods of discomfort. This could be anything as simple as worrying about a calculus test or grieving the death of loved one. Impaired functioning. A distinction must be made between simply a passing period of inefficiency and prolonged inefficiency, which seems unexplainable. Example of impairments include loss of a limb, loss of vision or memory loss. Bizarre behavior. Behavior that has no rational basis seems to indicate that the individual is confused. Example of bizarre behavior, such as smiling, laughing, or talking to oneself, or being preoccupied or responding to internal stimuli. It can include purposeless, ambivalent behavior or movements. Disruptive behavior means impulsive, apparently uncontrollable behavior that disrupts the lives of others or deprives them from their human rights on a regular basis. Example of disruptive behavior are making physical or verbal threats, making loud and distracting noises, and repeatedly entering and leaving a room without authorization. So that would be all. God, thank you and keep safe